Welcome to week 1 of Graphics 3, Place and Space. We really hope that you've had a good and a restful break and are excited about entering into this last of the graphic design disciplinary studios. Place and Space it's a super exciting course. We've scaffolded you through some graphic design fundamentals, through visual identity, into packaging and looking at small three-dimensional objects and their intersection with graphic solutions. And now we're looking at a more expansive three-dimensional environment as a place to make graphic design interventions. As usual, I just want to give you a bit of an overview of what the course looks like. As always, I will upload these slides and so you can look at this in more detail. Unlike the previous graphics courses in which we had two relatively equally weighted projects, but that were discrete, in this case we've got two projects, two parts of the one larger project that goes across all 10 weeks. And we felt that was really important at this stage, halfway through your degrees, to begin to build on the complexity of the project. So there are two assessment tasks. The first one, which we're calling Developing a Narrative, and all of this is going to make much more sense as we begin to unpack the course today. But developing a narrative, which is essentially a process of identifying, researching and communicating an issue or an historical viewpoint or a narrative that has impacted on a site. And there's a series of lectures and activities over the next 4 weeks that will lead to you to submitting a project at the start of your tutorial in week 5. So what you'll be submitting at that point is a research proposal. So we'll have a good sense of how you've built the narrative of your project, some of your initial ideas, in order to then lead that into the second half of the project, which will begin in week 5, which is assessment task 2, which is then to deploy that narrative and to do the substantive design work, and then to submit that as a design document in week 11, on Friday of week 11. A lot of this is going to seem really new to you, and for any of you who are familiar with the design squiggle, we're sure at the beginning of the process there'll be a lot of the kind of confusion that involves any kind of new project or design proposal or a series of design principles, but that's okay. That's the joy of learning something new. In the second assessment task, Deploying a Narrative, you'll actually be deploying your graphic narrative that you've explored, that you've proposed in your first assessment task, and then expressing some sort of design intervention, some sort of graphic intervention through words and images into a particular three-dimensional place or into a space of some sort. And we'll also be looking at paths and wayfinding as part of that project. This first lecture today, there's 2 lectures, is really just to introduce you to some terminology that really underpin the texture of the project. We're going to finish this lecture with a small class activity. You will reconvene in tutorial groups and discuss the assessment briefs. And then there'll be a longer lecture which will be introducing some further concepts to you. There's a lot of lecture today and a lot of words, so I think it's important that you go back to the slides afterwards to review those parts that don't make sense. So the first term that I want to introduce to you is this idea of city making. And city making broadly, and I've put the citation here for where I've taken this definition, is a way of improving our cities through the use of social and urban innovation. And there can be many players in that, including the designers and the design community. So again, I built this lecture today on lots of pieces of text that I've drawn from various sources. If we think of our cities as never-ending novels, with new chapters being continually written to shape their story, right now it seems we're losing the plot. The predominance of market-led, highest and best use urban renewal is creating a sense of urban sameness, where cities are beginning to lose their uniqueness and brand, in turn impacting their ability to attract and retain the creative people that enhance cultural capital. And this comes from the City Makers Guild. Again, I've put a link to that source. So the texture of this project is to begin to think about how we as graphic designers can develop and deploy narratives and stories back into city environments to begin to reclaim some of that uniqueness. Charles Landry, in The Art of City Making, has said cities need stories and need cultural narratives about themselves to both anchor and drive identity, as well as to galvanise citizens. And we've got a couple of examples here. This is a community-led kind of hacked intervention into one of the laneways in Melbourne. We might refer to this as tactical urbanism, and you can see where the laneway is given its character, is owned by the community through these strong graffiti-based interventions. And another example in Sao Paulo, a project called Using City, Making City, in which you can see this local market is a community intervention, again beginning to reclaim the sense of community, the sense of uniqueness, the sense of individuality, and the ownership of the city by the community. Here's a further example. This is a project called Midnight Moments in Times Square. This is a really fantastic project in which you will be aware that Times Square is rich with urban screens, urban media, but most of the time they're deployed into advertising and for commercial endeavours. And there was a project called Midnight Moments, which meant that every night at midnight, for a very small period of time, those screens were made available for the intervention of artists and designers in ways that were not driven by commercial intent. This example, Pattern Language by Peter Burr, is a really good example of an intervention that adds kind of texture, that adds another idea into Times Square. And there are a whole bunch of them. If you go to the website, you can see different projects that took over the screens there. What is placemaking? So placemaking is another term that you're going to see within this course. This particular quotation I've taken from Places in the Making, How Placemaking Builds Places and Communities from MIT. So placemaking today is ambitious and optimistic. At its most basic, the practice aims to improve the quality of a public place and the lives of its community in tandem. So you can see this has a relationship to city making. So put into practice, placemaking seeks to build or improve public space, to spark public discourse, to create beauty and to delight, engender civic pride, connect neighbourhoods, support community health and safety, grow social justice, catalyse economic development, promote environmental sustainability, and of course to nurture an authentic sense of place. I think you're beginning to see the texture of this project emerging, the texture of this course emerging. And so I've drawn this diagram from Project for Public Spaces in New York. You'll need to take a look at this in more detail, but it really tries to break down the attributes of what makes a great place. And these are really broad ranging, so they're partly about design interventions, but there are all sorts of other things that really contribute to what makes a great place, including what goes on in those spaces, the uses and the activities. So if we think about that market image in Sao Paulo, that's a good example of a use or activity as much as it is about a design intervention. I'm not going to go into this diagram in a lot of detail because I think that you really need to take a look at the PDF of this lecture and take a look at it in a little more detail. The next area I wanted to talk about is interpretation or interpretation design, which is an area of practice that I've been very involved in over my career. And this definition of interpretation is as a communication process designed to reveal meanings and the relationships of our cultural and our natural heritage through involvement with objects, artifacts, landscapes and sites. So this comes from Interpretation Canada. It should be stressed that interpretive communication is not simply presenting information, but a specific communication strategy that's used to translate that information for people, from the technical language of the expert to the everyday language of the visitor. So much of what we do as designers, as communication designers or graphic designers, is to think about our audience, to think about who we're talking to, and to really develop our communication solutions from their perspectives. So what does interpretation design look like? As examples, it can take the form of text and images, physical interventions, objects and forms, guided tours and interactions, sound, public art. Of course, as a graphic design course, we'll be really focusing on interventions that use techniques derived from graphic design as a field of practice. Although we do realise that as you're approaching the halfway point of your degree and you're heading toward the end of other studio disciplines such as interaction design or 3D visualization or object, that we might begin to see signs of that within your graphic design projects as well. And so I've got a couple of examples of interpretation design projects, both from Linda Warner's site. The link is at the bottom. And this was a project for the Gaia Walk that was done in Tasmania that Linda collaborated on with Peter Adams. And you can see that in this national park walk, there are a series of timber forms that carry kind of text, that carry interpretive messages about that walk, and that are placed within the site. So you'll discover these when they add a layer of communication and meaning that you will discover as you traverse this national park. And another project by Linda Warner, the Paper Pulp Trail in Burnie, which looks at the history of paper making as an important industry within the north of Tasmania. And there are a series of interventions. This is just one of them. If you go to Linda's site, there's a whole bunch of them that bring together these kind of concrete sculptural forms that are part graphic, part sculptural, part interpretive, bring together images and text that really tell the story of paper making. This is a good example of where graphic design and physical spatial design begin to intersect. And this example from the Smithsonian Institute, I think, is an interesting one that I've put in simply because it is an augmented reality type of intervention in which the object in front of you is added to by a layer of augmented reality over the top. So we see the object, but then we can delve more deeply into that object. And so some of your projects might touch on that as a field of practice. We're not expecting you to build augmented reality platforms, but you might propose kind of concepts that really touch on those ideas that you're able to communicate to us. The next term that I wanted to introduce you to, and it's one that you're most likely to have heard of, and that's wayfinding. And wayfinding, this quotation comes from the Society of Environmental Graphic Designers. It's a really great reference. If you can see the link there. It's a really great reference point because there are all sorts of examples of wayfinding interventions alongside interpretive interventions. Lots of work from all over the world that you can take a look at. It's a great resource. Wayfinding refers to information systems that guide people through a physical environment and enhance their understanding and experience of that space. So wayfinding is particularly important in complex built environments such as urban centres, healthcare and educational campuses, and transportation facilities. As architectural environments become more complicated, people need visual cues such as maps, directions, and symbols to help guide them to their destinations. Wayfinding can take the form of more conventionally understood signage systems, and so I've got a bit of an example here from Westerdols, which is a kind of design college, in which case you can see what we would recognise as a more conventional signage system. Although this one, I would argue, is a little bit more experimental than many that we see. I've got a feeling that this project was actually developed by a series of students within the institution under the mentorship of their kind of lecturers. And so you can see on the steps we have something that looks like a directory of what's on every level, and then we've got directional kind of signage. So that's a form of wayfinding. Or we could have less conventional interventions where, in this case, we have these kind of little messages that have been spray painted onto the pavement. When you get into these experimental wayfinding techniques, there's all sorts of things that you might explore that might be text-based, it might be object-based, and we'll be looking at a lot of that in this course. I'm not showing you lots of examples of work today. There'll be plenty of that to look at over the course of this project. And of course, we're hoping that you will do a lot of research of your own as well. So I've introduced you to just a whole bunch of really important underpinning kind of terminology that underpins, as I say, the texture of this kind of project. We're going to engage in a bit of an activity which your tutor will guide you through, where we're going to think about who the users in a public space might be, and your tutors will divide you into smaller groups to discuss a public space. They're going to give you a public space. We want you to think about the user groups. We want you to map as many different user groups who use that space, and to think about what their objectives in the space might be, what interactions they're likely to have with others, what's their interest in even being in the space, or what are the potential narratives or stories that the space evokes. So that activity is really going to launch you just into thinking about this idea of users and space and narratives and the kind of nature of this project. I'm going to leave this lecture here. You can jump into your group activities, and then there's a second lecture which we'll go through in a little while.